Hi, everyone, and thank you, Liza. So I'm really excited for today's session, especially if this is your first time really jumping into form building. I'm glad that I'm able to help guide you through that. So as Liza mentioned, my name's Berit. If at any point you do have questions, if I'm going too fast, please let me know. This session is supposed to be as helpful as possible to you, so I want to make sure that I achieve that. So as far as our agenda, we're going to start by talking about what we do to set up for success. And then we'll go through the different elements of form building. We'll go through the 3 form building golden rules. We'll talk through managing option lists, and then we have some fun announcements for you at the end of today's session. So let's set you up for success. To start, let's go through our project planning. So before you even jump into the form builder, you need to make sure you're aware of what type of data collection will be used by your end users. What I mean by this is, are they going to be making use of the mobile devices, the iOS and Android? Instead of that, are you going to use web forms, potentially public links, maybe all of those? If you're not sure what web forms and public links are, I will go through a little bit more of that later, but those are different versions of ways to collect data, more so on the computer versus those mobile devices. If your end users are going to make use of the mobile devices, make sure you're aware of what devices they're going to be using. This will change how you build your forms. If you're allowing your users to use any type of device, this definitely makes the form building process a little bit harder, because then you want to make sure you're testing on all of those device types instead of just like one. Another thought that you have to consider is, will your end users be collecting data online or offline? If you're going to allow them to collect in that offline environment, then you have to make sure you're using those mobile devices. And with that, the process of collecting the data offline, you can actually change some of the settings to make it a more fluid experience for your end users. Next, when it comes to your project planning, you want to think through what naming convention you're going to use. This is for the forms and the option lists. By setting yourself up for success with those naming conventions early on, you're able to share forms and save forms and kind of see the relationship between forms much easier than if you didn't necessarily follow one of our best practices, which is using _P for a top layer form and _C for a child or sub form. I'll be showing you a brief example of that in just a little bit, but keep that in mind as we go through the topics today. Another setup for success is to kind of think through the structure of your form. Are you going to make use of those subforms? Now, if this is your first time learning about iFormBuilder, and I keep saying this term subforms, you may not be aware of what I'm talking about. Essentially, a subform is its own form that can be attached to another. So you can kind of think of it as our parent form is that top layer, and then your child form is like that next chapter of the book that you're attaching to the title page, or yeah, basically the title page. So you're able to add these subforms, and users can complete those as much as you need to, or you can configure it so that they only complete it one time. So essentially, a subform, again, is its own form. You're just attaching them together. So when you're talking through the structure of the form, you want to think through, do you have repeating questions? If you do have repeating questions, make use of that subform. If you want to allow the user to take unlimited amount of photos, then put an image element or a multi-photo element into a subform and allow them to capture as many records as they need to. So there are different ways to split up your form, and thinking through that structure early on definitely helps you out. A next step is to think through what kind of elements you're going to use. So we have over 35 different elements, and so we try to make it so that you're able to collect the best and cleanest data possible. So this means usually that you're going to make use of a lot of our option list, so that you don't have the user typing in free responses. You can also use like our lookup element, which I'll talk through a little bit later on as well, where you're populating data from there and having it fill in some fields. And lastly, with your project planning, we have something called smart controls. Smart controls make use of JavaScript. So with our smart controls, you're able to add so much more to your form. So when you're planning out your project, you can think through, when do I want to show a question? When do I want to hide a question? Do I just want a field populated that's going to be used in the database or the data later on? So you're able to build out your form with these smart controls, and when you're planning out your project, note those so that when you're building it out, you have all the information you need. So diving a little bit deeper into that project planning. So one of the steps that we talked about is to build with the end users in mind and making sure you're aware of what devices they're going to use, but also if they're going to make use of public links and web forms. When it comes to the devices, we do support Android and iOS. When you're building out your form, make sure you're testing on the smallest device that the user is going to have access to. If it looks good on that small device, it's going to look amazing on that bigger one. So make sure you're always testing on the smallest. As I mentioned before, if there's any chance that your end users are going to be making use of Android and iOS, test on both. Because when it comes to some of the JavaScript and how the operating systems run those JavaScript statements, those two devices can run differently. And so you want to make sure that you've tested in both scenarios. With that being said, of course, your web forms and public links will also run differently than what you see on your device. Now, let me give you a little bit more information here on web forms and public links. So with web forms, we do have it so that a user has to log in, so that they log into their iFormBuilder account and they can start collecting data in that web form. The web form follows the same logic and smart controls as what you designed for your mobile devices. So it is a similar experience, except for the fact that it's on a laptop and the user has to have Wi-Fi or cellular connection. Now our public links here, and these are generated when you're building out your form, and essentially you're able to send a link to anyone. They don't need to have a login. And when you do that, when you make use of our public links, you do have to keep in mind that there is some functionality in the forms that won't work on a public link versus when someone is logged in. That goes a little bit deeper with that. We have something called iFormBuilder built-in functions, where you can actually call to a person's username, first name or last name, as well as a lot of other information. With those public links, you can't populate that information if you don't have it because they're not logging in. So keeping that in mind and how it's different will help you and help build a project more successfully. Next, we have our organization of the forms and our naming convention. So as I mentioned before, we do have our subforms. I have another overview here of what subforms are. And if you're able to attend our session, we have a FormBuilder 102 session. It's going to be next week, I believe. We'll send you the sign up information for that. But during that session, I'll walk you through how to add the subforms. But here's a high level overview of what they are. And here's also how we do that naming convention. So you'll notice that that parent form has the _P, and all the child forms or all the subforms that are connected have the _C. All right, let's jump into these best practices. As you're building your forms, make sure you have a device handy. Make sure it's right next to you. Make sure you have multiple devices handy if you have to test on iOS and Android. Additionally, if you're building out your form and you have a parent form and a sub form, and maybe you're making use of the lookup element, have tabs open for all the forms that you're currently using. This will make it so much easier when it comes to building out smart controls and copying and pasting some of the information that you need for those smart controls to run. One thing to note here is every single form that you create is automatically assigned to your username. Because of that, that means when you build a subform or if you're building a form that's used for the lookup element, those will automatically be assigned to your username and you may not want to see them on your device. So this is just one of those best practices that once I build out those forms, I actually go back under form assignment and I unassign those forms from my username so that I don't have to see them on my device because the parent form is going to download that information and we don't need to have additional forms on our device. We probably already have enough. Our next best practice here is to limit the amount of elements on a form. So a rule of thumb has kind of been try not to have more than 100 elements on a layer of a form. This could be hidden elements as well. Instead of having 200 questions on one layer, put some of those questions into subforms. The reason for that being is the way that the iForm app syncs to the cloud. We go layer by layer so that we don't have a timeout or aren't trying to basically upload too much data because then it might take too long and again you'll get that timeout error message. So instead, let's split up those questions into the subform so that the subform will try to sync and then the parent form will try to sync. And if there's any pause, then it can kind of pick up where it left off without trying to resync everything all over again. And our next best practice here is to add a description to fields that have longer, more in-depth directions. So when we go into the form builder, I'll show you where that description area is and where that can be really helpful. Now, descriptions aren't shown for all the elements, and we actually have a help desk article that goes through which ones it'll show for and which ones it won't. But essentially, you want to keep in mind that if you are asking a more in-depth question, putting in a description will be really helpful for your end user, which then will probably get you better data. Our next best practice here, which is something that's kind of silly to have to say, but it's really important, include directions to the users. So teach them how to complete your form because every form can be so different. So include as much information as possible to help them for that better data collection experience. And lastly, before I go into before we actually go through a demonstration and start building out some of this functionality, make sure you follow our Form Builder golden rules. And I will talk through that, just bear with me one second. In the slides, I do have a list of all of our elements, and you can see that here. I am going to kind of walk you through these as we go into the form builder, so I'm not going to spend too much time here, but I do want to make sure when we send over this presentation to you later, you will have access to it. Now, before I actually go into the golden rules, are there any questions? And do we have another poll that we can run here, Liza?
Yeah, we have a second poll that we can use. Looks like we don't have any questions at this time, but while you're filling out the poll, feel free to drop anything in the box. Okay, so a quick poll, just take a few seconds. We're just curious about your personal level of expertise with iFormBuilder. Okay, give it a couple more seconds. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. Looks like we have some that are brand new, a few beginners, and a good chunk that have been building forms for a while. We're really excited to have all of you here.
Great. So thank you. Now that helps me a little bit more as we go to this next section. So let's just talk through these golden rules, and then we're actually going to jump into the form builder. So here's our first golden rule. Again, something so simple, but super important to remember. Make sure you're always testing your forms before you're deploying it to your users. So test on the different operating systems. That includes your web forms, your iOS, your Android. Make sure it's all looking good there. Again, test on that smallest device. As we talked about earlier, if it looks good on the smallest device, it's going to look amazing on those bigger ones. Also test on the iForm app that your end users are going to be using. So if you have a white label, essentially a white label is where a customer can put their own branding on the iForm app. If you have a white label, make sure you're testing in the white label. White labels also allow you to kind of control the version of the app that your end users have, so that makes it a little bit easier. Another way to kind of make sure that you're testing on what your end users have is make sure all your end users are always updating to the latest version of the iForm app, and that's what you'll use to test. So if it works there, it's going to work for all your users. So our testing continued. It's not just as easy as go through quickly, answer some of the questions, and then sync. Instead, you have to make sure you do the entire form, and you're checking all the option lists. You're making sure all the subforms have been attached. Check for spelling, even though a lot of our computers tell us when we have spelling errors, sometimes we overlook those. So check those all out. Also, make sure you sync that record to the cloud and then look at the data. So when we look at our data, this I'll just show you really quickly here. When we go to our data views, we have views here and feeds. When you are building out forms, you always want to look at the feeds. The feeds are going to include the data column names that we use when we're building out our forms. And this is what we want to make sure we're not using my element 1, my element 2, my element 3, and so on. Now, when I say that, again, I know we have some individuals who have never built a form before. So when I say that, I'll show you where those my elements can sometimes default and cause issues with your data when you do your export. Also, test all the different scenarios of your smart controls. So that, knowing that sometimes you'll have a statement that says, if the user says yes, show these questions. If they say no, then show these or hide these. So test those different scenarios and sync both of those different scenario records to the cloud and make sure that you understand how the data is going to look for that. And lastly, test early and test often. So whenever I'm building a form, again, I have my device right next to me as I'm building it, but I add a few elements, I save my form, and then I test. I add, save, test. So I'm constantly testing instead of waiting till the end. This also saves you a lot of time because if you don't test as you build and you have to go through it starting the first at the end, it's much easier to miss things, but also you might not see where your JavaScript might be breaking or whatnot. So just test as you build, essentially. Our second golden rule here is one that we try to make it so we actually make it impossible for you to make this mistake now, but we keep this in here because of our API. But make sure you use unique data column names that are database friendly. When we actually go through our demonstration, I will show you what I mean by that by trying to put in one of our reserved words that's not database friendly. I'll see an error, and then from there, I'll have to go and fix that name before I can save my form. Lastly, do not change the element type and encryption on a live form, so a form that's already been deployed to your users, because it will delete the data. If you do need to make some of those changes, instead make a copy of the original element, and then from there, make the necessary changes and then hide the original element. or disable the original element. That way, it's no longer being downloaded to the user's device, but you still have that row of data, so you're not losing anything. All right, so now we're going to go into the fun part. So if you have an iFormBuilder account, feel free to walk through these steps with me. What we're going to do in this demonstration, we're going to go through the iFormBuilder home screen. We're also going to go through the process of creating a new form. We'll go into the different form builder views and how to add elements, and then how to edit the form properties if you need to do that. This is just going to be step one of our demonstration, and then we'll go into another demonstration in a few minutes after after we go through this process. Again, if there are any questions, please let me know and I'm happy to help. So let me make this a little bit bigger for everybody. So under our menu in iFormBuilder, under Forms, you'll see where it says Form Builder. If you don't see where it says Form Builder, that means that your username doesn't have that permission. And so keep that in mind, that if you don't see the Form Builder, it's because that permission has to be granted to you. So the first thing I want to point out here is this is our default view of the Form Builder. We see our ID, we see the label. The label is what the user is going to see on their device. And then we see the name. The name is what we use in our database. This is also what we may use in our smart controls at times. Then here at the end, we have our actions. So if you hover over each action, it'll tell you a little bit about what you're able to do there. The ones I want to point out here is we have a post data endpoint. So if you are integrating with other systems, maybe you have other web services that you're connecting with, you can come in and connect your form to that web service with this endpoint. If you want to make use of the public links that we talked about earlier, once those have been enabled in your account, you can come in, click the public link button, and you can even set a password if you want to. But you can just generate the link, and once that link has been generated, you can copy it and send it out to anyone that you need to, so that they can fill it out on their laptop or their device. We do suggest that you use Google Chrome or Firefox with public links. I also suggest that you use Google or Firefox when you're building out your forms, because that's what we're always testing with. So just a little bit more on this Forms home screen. These buttons here are clickable, and so you can add more to see your table, see more information in this table. Let's say you're looking and you realize, okay, I didn't add a description to a form, and you want to add a description. So by tapping this green icon in our Actions section, it allows you to edit some of the fields in the table. So now I can come in, I could change the label, the name, or the description. Now this particular section, this description, is shown to the user in the little info section of the form. So let me just show you that. So here is my device. Here's a list of forms that I have in my account here. You'll notice that I have the little I at the bottom of the forms. If there was a description, let me come in here, you'll see some of the descriptions in the details section. And now I got to that by tapping the I icon and editing the form properties here in my table. So also you'll notice up top here, you can jump between building forms and building option lists. We're going to go through the option list building after this demo, but I did want you to keep in mind that you are able to create lists separate from actually the forms themselves. Additionally, when we do build our forms, you can create lists there as well. We call that the inline option list builder. That doesn't have as much functionality as this section here. So when it comes to building out option lists, I usually tell people, If it's a longer list, if you have smart controls that need to go along with that list, definitely build it here. Also, if you're looking to copy and paste a list, you want to use this option list builder and not the inline option list builder that comes from the form builder, form builder interface. Okay, so let's jump back to our forms, our form builder interface. The last thing I want to point out before we actually go through the process of creating a form is that we do have this little drop down for enabled form and disabled forms. So disabled forms are exactly what it sounds like. You've gone in and you're no longer using that form. You don't want to see it on this list anymore. So you can actually edit the form properties, choose to disable the form, and then see it in the list of disabled forms. Disabling a form is really helpful if you are doing versions of a form, so you know what is currently being used and assigned to your users. All right, with that, let's now go through this process of creating a new form. So as you can see in the right-hand corner, we have our green button that says Create Form. We'll start with the basic information. You will see that we do have an advanced section that you can always jump to as well, but we're going to just go with our basics for this first form that we're building. So again, our form label is what we're going to see on the iForm home screen. Now, underneath the form label, we do have the table name. This is what we want to make sure we're using our naming convention for, and this is also where we have those underscores and how the information's saved in the databases. So you can check off the box that says based on label. If you do that, you can actually uncheck it and then add the underscore P. So you remember that that is that parent form. Here is the description field. So you can add that description that is available when you tap the I button within the iForm home screen. From there, you can choose a form icon. You'll notice we do have our standard icons. We have custom icons. If you want to upload your own icons here, you can. Just make sure you're following our recommendations for what it needs to be. I'm going to jump back to my standard icon for today. We'll just choose the simple house and go from there. I'm going to pause here before we go any further. Are there any questions, Liza?
Looks like we don't have any questions at this time, Berit. Everyone's just soaking on all the information.
All right. So now that we're in this interface, I do want to just point out some key features before we start adding some elements. So on the left-hand side, you'll notice that this is a list of all the elements that we have. When it comes to building out your form, it's as simple as selecting one of the elements. It goes into this device interface, and then you move over and you add your label and your name and any of the smart controls that you need to, as well as if you need to see more info about the element, you just scroll to the bottom. Now on these element property sections, and in this section here, this is going to change based off of the type of element that you choose. So our element properties here, for a date element, we don't have any dynamic attributes. We don't have any way to limit the amount of characters. But in some of our other elements, and you'll see that as we add them, we do have more options. So keep that in mind as you build out your form. Now, what I want to point out here before we add any of that information is right now I'm in this, what we refer to as the default device view. If you're someone who prefers to be in more of like an Excel or table view, that is an option. So you'll notice up here in the left-hand corner, you can minimize that element screen, but right now our device screen is selected. And now if you click on the table screen, it brings you to this table view. In this table view, you will see that everything is yellow. This means it hasn't been saved yet. So that is a nice little indicator, a visual indicator right away that you do need to save your form. And that's done by one of our action icons in the right-hand corner, which is that little floppy disk. So if you go ahead and save, then my table is going to update and I won't see that yellow color anymore. Now, while I talk about these actions up here, you'll see some of the familiar actions from what we saw on that iFormBuilder home screen. So you're able to create that public or private link for your form from this interface. If you are looking at a form that is essentially designed as a subform, you can come in and see the dependencies. So you're able to see the parent form name and what other forms it's connected to. So that's really helpful if you are building out subforms and you want to see the relationships between the subforms and the parent form. If you need to go back to that edit form properties page, that original page that we started when we created our form, then you're able to click the tool icon and it brings us back to the screen. If you wanted to do that post data endpoint, that can be done here as well. And lastly, we have a section for page level JavaScript. So if you are building out a smarter form that has a lot more logic to it, then that's where you'll perform your page level JavaScript. Page level JavaScript has to be placed in the parent form to be applicable to any of the subforms attached. So if you are more advanced in using that page level JavaScript, keep in mind it has to be at the top level. All right, so I'm going to jump back to that device view. I find it a lot cleaner and easier to use as I build out my form because you're able to see everything that applies. So the first thing that we added here was this date element. So I'm going to come in and type in today's date. Now you'll notice underneath the label is the name. Oftentimes we refer to this as the data column name. This is what we see in the database. And this is what we also see in that XLS feed or any of the feeds. As I mentioned before with our best practices, you want to make sure that the data column name is helpful. My element 1 is not a helpful data column name. So there's two ways that you can edit this. You can come in and actually change it from here, or you can check off the box that says based on label. And so that will default it to whatever the label is. Now, again, I'll show you in just a minute how if you have it based on label, if you use one of those non-database friendly terms, that you'll receive an error message. Go ahead and save my form. And let's jump back to make sure we're going through everything that we need to do with our demonstration here. So far, so good. The only piece that we haven't talked about is how to copy, edit, or change elements. And I'll also show you how to disable forms. But let's go back to the form builder itself here. And what we can do is I will show you how you can copy an element. So we have these little action icons inside with the elements themselves. So we have the copy, we have cut, so you can actually cut and paste more than one element, and then you can delete an element. Right now, I'm going to just copy our date element and put in time. And you'll notice the second that I put in time, it does tell me that it is a reserved word. I get the error message. So I can keep the label as time, but change the data column name. So now I've changed this to time and we've changed the data column name. I actually want to change the element type as well. So this is where you're able to change an element type versus adding and deleting if you do an incorrect one. So in the element type, I can come in and choose the time element from my options. Now again, if this was a live form, it would delete the data that I had captured there. But because this is just a form that we're creating now and testing out, we don't have to worry about that. Within the iFormBuilder, we do try to make it so that you make as little error as possible with deleting data. So that's why we do have a lot of error messages pop up to make sure you really mean to change things. All right, let's save our form here. We're going to add a few more elements, and then I'll go back to our slides and we'll talk through our option list. So we have the date, we have the time. What's really nice about this time element is we actually have a dynamic attribute associated to it. So we have 4 elements that have dynamic attributes. Essentially, those are other ways that you can customize how the element functions. And with the time element, you're able to specify if the data is captured in a 12-hour time period or 24-hour. And so it actually overrides the device's setting as well. So this will give you better data and more cohesive data from your users if you can define this here. So I'm going to save my, I save often, as you can see here. So let's add a few more elements. As I mentioned, we'll add our location element. And I noticed that the name here is saying my element 2. I'll come and put this as based on label. I will come in here, I'll add a text element. So here, I'm assuming that I'm going on site and I need to understand what the person who's collecting the data, what they're seeing on site. So I'm asking them to describe the surrounding area. Now what's nice here is I do have this description field. So this is where I can copy this and even add more information. And when we look at this element in the iForm app, we will see whatever's listed in this description. Okay, so I'm going to save my form. And at this time, I'm actually going to sync up my device and show you what it looks like. While I'm syncing my device, are there any questions?
We do have one question, Berit. So this person asked, in older forms, we occasionally see errors that say something like error at index 0. What is a good way to figure out where the error is in the form that is preventing from saving?
Awesome question. So when you see those errors, it is talking about the order of the elements within the form. The fastest way to see that is actually go into the info for the element and see what the sort order is. And just a little bit more background is we always start with 0. So 0, 1, 2, 3. But let's say you do have a form of 55 elements. You don't want to go through and find exactly, but you don't want to go through by counting. So coming and seeing this sort order in the info section is the easiest way to do that. Okay, so let me show my device here. Oh, I guess I stopped showing it. Hold on. Give me 1 second. Okay, so as I scroll down here, I have my webinar 2024. If I type tap the info section. It says this form is used for the Form Builder 101 webinar. I can open up the form by tapping this button in the corner. We have our today's date. Just make a selection here. The time, as we recall, we had set this up so it's a 24-hour period. We don't have the option to do the 12 hours. We can click where it says now to have it jump back to the current time, then make our selection. Here's our GPS location. I'm going to hit refresh here and then hit done, and that populates all the GPS information that we have here. The map can also show up here. You can zoom out if you need to, and then zoom back in as well. Now here's our text element where we included our description. There's our description right underneath. So the user can type everything in and see the additional information that we added here. What you may notice is anytime you use an element that launches another window, it puts the question at the top. So when you have that longer question or that longer label, it's not going to show the whole label at the top, it'll cut it off. So that's where using the description field can be really helpful. Okay, let's jump back to some of our slides here. So let's talk through our option lists. Option lists, again, are the easiest and fastest way to eliminate error because you're able to configure what options you're showing the users, and they can make those selections versus having to type in information. When it comes to our option list, we actually have 4 different elements that you can assign options to. There's the email element, the multi-select element, a pick list, and the select. We've created this little decision tree to kind of help you gauge when you should use each type of option list. So the first decision you have to make, are you allowing the user to choose one option or multiple options? If it is multiple options, very simply, you're going to use the multi-select element. If you're going to only allow them to choose one single option, then you have to decide, do you have a short list or a long list? So when we say short, we're really referencing, 3 to 4 elements that aren't very text-heavy options. So this is the select element is great for the yes, no, not applicable, whereas a pick list you'll use for all the states abbreviations or all the different species of animals you're looking at. So select for your short and pick list for your longer list. Now I do have some additional information on option lists on these slides. You'll see here what we're going to do right now is we're actually going to go through the process of building and adding a option list to our form. And we're going to make use of both the inline option list builder within the form builder, as well as our option list builder that is that separate window. So I want to show you both scenarios so that you feel comfortable moving forward using the correct option list elements and the using both the inline builder and the option list builder. So let's jump back here to our form. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add that select element. So again, the select element is great for that yes, no, non-applicable. It's going to show those buttons within the form. So I'm just asking, was the supervisor on site? So that's that yes or no or non-applicable kind of question. So if I scroll down in our element properties, now we see this section for option lists. If I click on option lists, in here you have the ability to create a new list at the bottom. If you already have a list, you can just search for it. I have my yes, no, not applicable. And so I'll make that selection here. And then I'll click assign selected. Something to keep in mind here is that in our right-hand corner, you can also see the dependencies of a list. So the same way you can see dependencies of a form, you can see it on a list as well. This is really helpful if you are looking to try to edit an option list, because option lists are universal in your iFormBuilder profile. So if you make an edit to it, it is going to impact the other forms that are making use of that option list. So if you're wondering where the option list is being used, and looking at the dependencies can be super helpful. So now I'm just going to click Assign Selected, and now I've added the select element with the yes, no, not applicable question to my form. So that is that inline builder. Again, I'll just click on here to show you the overview again. If you have a list, you can just search for it and then select it and assign it from this view. If you need to create a list, you would click the Create List button. When you do create a list, after you hit the Create button, you then have to search for the one that you just created to then fill in the options. Within the option list builder and in this inline builder, you'll see that we have our sort order, our label, and our key value. So all of this, what this means here is the sort order is the order it's going to appear in the option list element on your form. So you can actually change that order from this view. We have the label, that's what the user sees on the element. Whereas the key value, that's what we're going to see in our data and our database. This key value is also what we would use when we do our smart control statements. If you need to copy elements, cut and paste, delete elements, we have the same actions here as we do with our form builder when you're building out your forms. Lastly, we have a condition value section. I'm not going to go too far into this right now, but when you are doing skip logic or you're trying to decide when an option appears to a user, that's where you'll add it in the condition value here. So I'll close this right now. And before we jump into the option list builder, I am going to edit this form and add a pick list element. So here I just want them to select the individual on site. So I'll have a list of names that the user would choose. And if I had built out this form with smart controls, I would have it where if the user said yes to there being a supervisor on site, then they would see this question. If they said no, they would not see this question. I am going to make this a required field just so that you can see what that looks like here. So this is done in this element properties. And then I'm going to save my form. Now I know we haven't added a option list to this element. By default, the first option list that we have in our account is automatically assigned to this element. And that's okay because that allows us to save. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go into our option list builder, and I'm going to open this in a new tab to show you what it looks like. And I'm going to create a list. Now, whenever I create a list, I try to make sure I make a name of the list that's helpful to identify what form this list is connected with. So I'll call it Webinar 2024. And I'll click Create. Now again, this interface looks very similar to what we saw in that inline builder, but the difference you'll see here is we have an upload option as well as a download option. So the download option definitely comes in handy if you are trying to make edits to your list. So you can download that current list, make edits, and then re-upload. In this case, we haven't actually created the list yet, so we can just click the upload option, and you can either upload raw data or a CSV upload, which saves a lot of time from having to type when you already have that information. You can just copy and paste it right in, and then the key value and the label and sort order are already created for you that way. I'll just type in some raw text here. And click upload. Now, as I looked at this, I'm like, okay, well, I only have 4 individuals listed here. What if there's somebody else that I'm not taking into account? So I can add an other field. And what I would do is in my form design, I would have it where a text element would only show up if other was selected, and then the user could type in that other option. So I'm still collecting really good data. From here, I'm going to save my list. And then I'm going to go to this action icon, which is right next to the trash can, where I can assign the list to the form elements. And I'm going to search for my webinar 2024 form that I started. Here's my parent form. And what this does is it shows me all of the elements that I have in my form that are option list elements. So I'm going to select the specific pick list one that we had created earlier and assign this option list to that element. And if I jump back here and I'm going to refresh this screen, I'm going to see that this now has the new list that we created automatically assigned. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to refresh my device here and check to make sure my lists are there and working as expected. As my device syncs, are there any questions, Liza?
Yes, it does look like we have one more question about option lists. So they asked, option lists are limited to 100 items. Is there a way to increase that number?
So option lists can have more than 100 items. It just means that how should I say this? So I've had option lists that have 600 items before, and you can use the CSV upload for that. Now, when you have more than 100 options, you can only see 100 options on a page. So you'll see a section up top that says page 1, page 2, page 3, and so on. So we do allow you to have more than 100 options in a list. Let me jump back to my device here. Here we have our yes, no, non-applicable. And then we have our pick list, which has our individuals. Now, let's say we do have a list that has 600 options. We do allow you to search. So if you have, if you know what you're searching for, you can type that in. Additionally, sometimes groups will have it where they'll have the first option as other, so that the person filling it out knows that they can put another option in or add text for what the other option is, instead of having to scroll through all 600 pieces to then find out, hey, it's not listed here. Now, if I try to sync my device and I haven't filled out that individuals, I do get a notification letting me know that this is a draft and I have to fill that information in before I can sync my device. This table can also be edited. Keep that in mind as you build out your form. That is, we do have something called reference IDs, which I talk through in the next section or session next week, the 102. And so you're able to configure how this table appears. Also, in the iForm home screen, you'll notice, or in this form screen, you'll notice you can delete records from here. You can choose to hide this trash can from your users. So again, that's another customization we'll talk through. Anytime you're creating a new record, you hit the plus button. And if you want to see your record on a map, then you can click the map button. Now we're getting close to the end of today's session, so let me just jump over here and do a few announcements, or actually, can we do a quick poll and then I'll do some announcements?
Sure, I'm going to go ahead and launch the final poll. And while I do that, Berit, there is one final question. Someone asking if there is an autosave option.
Great question. And this is something our team has gone back and forth with a long time coming, because we know that it'd be super helpful for the form to be able to be saving instead of us having to hit save all the time. But what we found is that if we were to put autosave in, then the computer would try saving when you're in the midst of doing changing like the data column name that's not database friendly, or it would try to save when you have some of those errors and you'd end up running into more issues. So that's why we say, okay, as an end user, you have to go through the process of saving instead of having autosync in place. We just found it would be too many issues with autosync because of all the different statements that we allow you to add and all the functionality that we have within the platform. Some announcements, and we'll send all these links over in our follow-up email. We do have Zerion Academy asynchronous getting started courses. And so I know for those individuals who are brand new to the platform, you may have heard about it from our Josh or from some of our sales employees, but the asynchronous course is available to everybody and you can go in and have access to it. With that, you're able to do some of our getting started information on form assignments, how to manage your users, how to export data. So it gives you a lot of information to make the most of the platform. We have 2 upcoming webinars. Form Building 102 is on the 25th. And then we have next month on the 22nd, we have Zerion AI with our CEO, Z Wang. We also have a really exciting event, save the date for Zerion Reimagined. This is in Herndon, Virginia. It's September 11th through the 13th. If you can attend, that would be amazing. We're also looking for presenters, and we'll have workshops. We'll have some ceremonies with awards, and of course, just a good time talking with and learning from our customers.